London, 1845. Julia Zachariah's gloved fingertips trembled as they traced the words printed in the society pages of the Morning Post. Her own name stared back at her in stark black ink, the letters forming a narrative so scandalous that she could scarcely believe it described her life. Miss Julia Zachariah, previously of respectable standing though modest means, was discovered in a most compromising position with the Marquess of Valborough during Lady Hempstead's annual spring ball. Sources report the pair were found alone in the conservatory long after propriety would allow, and in a state of significant disarray. One wonders if wedding bells shall ring before the season's end, or if the Marquis shall follow his reputation and leave yet another heart in ruins. Julia crushed the paper in her fist, her chest heaving with indignation. One impulsive moment, one foolish, reckless moment of weakness, and her reputation lay in tatters. The article said nothing of how the Marquis had pursued her relentlessly since her arrival in London 3 months prior. Nothing of how his charming smile and intense gaze had slowly worn down her defenses. Nothing of the vulnerability she'd shown him when he'd finally convinced her to step away from the crowded ballroom for just a moment of honest conversation. What a fool she had been. A sharp rap at her bedroom door jolted her from her thoughts. "Julia!" Her aunt's voice was shrill with panic. "Julia, open this door immediately." With leaden limbs, Julia crossed the modest bedchamber of her aunt and uncle's townhouse. She had come to London at their invitation, an orphan niece of 22 with little prospects beyond becoming a governess or lady's companion. Her aunt had promised to introduce her to society, to give her 1 season to perhaps secure a suitable match before necessity dictated her future path. Now that future had certainly been decided, though in a manner none of them had anticipated. She opened the door to find her aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Pembroke, clutching a copy of the same newspaper, her face ashen. "Tell me it isn't true," her aunt whispered, even as her eyes darted over Julia's countenance searching for confirmation. Julia steeled herself. "It is not as it appears in print, aunt." "But you were alone with him?" "Unchaperoned." The older woman's voice rose with each question. "In the conservatory?" "After midnight." "Yes, but there are no buts in matters of reputation." Her aunt thrust the paper toward her. "Your uncle is beside himself. We vouched for you, Julia. We presented you to our friends, to society." Julia felt her throat constrict. "I'm sorry, aunt." "The Marquis, he said he merely wished to speak with me about Marquess Valborough does not merely speak with young women in darkened conservatories." Her aunt paced the small room. "He is notorious, Julia. Charming, wealthy, titled, and utterly unscrupulous when it comes to women. His reputation as a seducer is well established." Julia sank onto the edge of her bed. "I was foolish. Beyond foolish." Her aunt's expression softened marginally. "What precisely happened?" "The truth now, for your uncle will demand it." "We spoke." "He?" Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He kissed me. And then Lady Hempstead's butler discovered us. And that is all." Her aunt's penetrating gaze made Julia squirm. "Yes, aunt. I swear it." Mrs. Pembroke closed her eyes briefly, relief evident in her posture. "Well, that is something, at least. But it hardly matters in the eyes of society. You were alone with him, unchaperoned, and were found in what did the paper say? A state of significant disarray. Your reputation is compromised beyond repair." "Surely it will blow over," Julia said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "It was one indiscretion is all it takes." Her aunt moved to the window, looking out at the London street below. "Your uncle has already received a note from Lord Valborough himself. He will call at 11. Julia's stomach dropped. "The Marquis is coming here? Today?" "Indeed." Her aunt turned, her expression grim. "And I suspect I know the purpose of his visit." The Marquess of Valborough cut an imposing figure as he stood in the Pembrokes' modest drawing-room. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of burnished mahogany and eyes of piercing grey, Marquess Valborough carried himself with the easy confidence of a man born to privilege and power. Julia sat rigidly on the settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as her uncle and the Marquess exchanged terse pleasantries. Her aunt sat beside her, a silent, watchful presence. "I shall come directly to the point," the Marquis said finally, his rich baritone filling the room. "My behavior last evening has placed Miss Zachariah in an untenable position, for which I take full responsibility." "As well you should, my lord," Mr. Pembroke replied stiffly. The Marquis inclined his head in acknowledgment. "I have therefore come to offer the only honourable resolution. I wish to ask for Miss Zachariah's hand in marriage." Though she had suspected this might be his purpose, the actual word still struck Julia like a physical blow. Her gaze flew to his face, searching for some sign of the charming, attentive man who had pursued her so determinedly. Instead, she found only cool civility in his expression. "This is most unexpected, Lord Valborough," her uncle said, clearly caught off guard despite the obviousness of the solution. "Is it?" The Marquis raised an eyebrow. "I should think it the expected course of action when a gentleman compromises a lady's reputation." "Your reputation suggests you do not always follow the expected course, my lord," her aunt said pointedly. A flash of something, irritation? Amusement, crossed the Marquis's face. "Fair observation, madam. Yet here I stand." "Out of obligation," Julia said quietly, speaking for the first time. "Not desire." The Marquis turned his gaze to her, and for a brief moment, she glimpsed a crack in his aristocratic facade, a flicker of the intensity she had seen the previous night. "Miss Zachariah," he said, his voice softer. "May I speak with you privately?" "Absolutely not," her uncle interjected. "That is what led to this predicament." With the door open, then, the Marquis amended, "and your aunt and uncle just outside. I believe I owe Miss Zachariah a more personal proposal than this." After a moment's hesitation, her uncle nodded curtly. 5 minutes. We shall be directly outside this door." When they had withdrawn, though not far, as the sound of her aunt's nervous pacing could be heard clearly in the hallway, the Marquis moved to sit beside Julia on the settee. "You're angry with me," he observed. "I'm angry with myself," she replied. "For believing you sincere." I am, sincere." He leaned forward, those grey eyes intent on hers. "Julia, I pursued you because I was genuinely captivated by you from the moment we were introduced. You are unlike any woman I have met in society, forthright, intelligent, unaffected by titles and wealth. Yet you ruined me." He had the grace to wince at her blunt assessment. "That was never my intention. I wanted privacy to speak with you, to tell you that He stopped, seeming to collect himself. "I admit I acted impulsively. The kiss was presumptuous. And now you offer marriage as penance." "I offer marriage because it is what I wanted all along." The words hung between them, startling in their directness. Julia stared at him, searching for deception. "You cannot expect me to believe that." "Why not?" "Because of my reputation." His mouth twisted in a rueful smile. "Much of which is exaggerated, I assure you. Because you are a Marquis, heir to a dukedom, while I am a penniless orphan with no connections to speak of," Julia countered. "Such matches are not made except in novels, my lord." "Marcus," he corrected. "And perhaps I find the conventional matches of the ton unbearably dull. Perhaps I want a wife who challenges me, who speaks her mind, who sees me as a man rather than a title." Despite herself, Julia felt a flicker of the same attraction that had led her into the conservatory the night before. She tamped it down ruthlessly. "If you truly wish to marry me, you should have approached my uncle properly. Instead, you engineered a situation that forces my hand just as surely as it forces yours." He was silent for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "I have not gone about this in a way that inspires your trust. But I am asking you now, properly if belatedly, will you marry me, Julia Zachariah?" She looked at him, this handsome, complicated man who had upended her life in the span of a single evening, and knew that despite everything, her answer would change her fate forever. 2 weeks later, Julia stood before the ornate full-length mirror in what was to be her dressing room at Valborough House, the Marquess's London residence. She hardly recognized the woman who stared back at her, draped in ivory silk and Brussels lace, her dark hair arranged in an elegant coiffure beneath a delicate veil. "You look beautiful," her aunt said from behind her, voice thick with unshed tears. "Like your mother on her wedding day." Julia attempted a smile. "Thank you for all your help, Aunt. I know this is not how you imagined my London season would conclude." "No," her aunt admitted. "But a marriage to a marquis, even under these circumstances, it is beyond what we could have hoped for you." Beyond what they could have hoped for, yes. But was it what Julia wanted? She still wasn't certain. The past fortnight had been a whirlwind of preparations, with barely a moment to catch her breath, let alone contemplate the enormity of the step she was about to take. She had seen Marcus only a handful of times since accepting his proposal, always under the watchful eyes of her aunt or his mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess. Their conversations had been pleasant but superficial, as if both were reluctant to disturb the fragile peace between them. "It is time," her uncle announced from the doorway. He would escort her down the aisle of St. George's, Hanover Square, where half the aristocracy awaited the scandalous wedding of the season. As they made their way to the church, Julia fought to calm her racing heart. She had agreed to this marriage partly out of necessity. What other option did she have, with her reputation in tatters, but also because, despite everything, she could not deny the powerful attraction she felt toward Marquess Valborough. There had been moments of genuine connection between them, glimpses of a man she could perhaps grow to love. But would he ever see her as more than an obligation? A mistake that had to be rectified? The church doors opened, and Julia felt all eyes turned to her. At the altar stood Marcus, resplendent in formal attire, his expression impossible to read at this distance. Beside him was his closest friend, the Earl of Westmoreland, serving as best man. With each step down the aisle, Julia's doubts seemed to multiply. She was marrying a virtual stranger, a man of wealth and privilege whose world was utterly foreign to her. A man with a reputation for loving and leaving women. A man who might resent her for trapping him in this marriage. And then she reached the altar, and Marcus turned to her. What she saw in his eyes then, warmth, admiration, and something else she dared not name, steadied her nerves somewhat. "You are breathtaking," he whispered, too low for others to hear. The service proceeded with all the pomp befitting the marriage of a future duke. Julia spoke her vows in a clear voice that betrayed none of her inner turmoil. And then, with the exchange of rings and the vicar's pronouncement, it was done. She was no longer Miss Julia Zachariah, but Julia, Marchioness of Valborough. The wedding breakfast that followed at Valborough House was a glittering affair, with champagne flowing freely and the cream of society in attendance, many of whom, Julia noted wryly, had come simply to gawk at the scandalous bride who had trapped the elusive Marquis. "Ignore them," Marcus murmured in her ear as they received yet another set of guests whose congratulations rang hollow. "Half of them are jealous, and the other half are merely bored and hungry for gossip." "Which half does your mother belong to?" Julia asked, glancing toward the Dowager Duchess, who had been coolly civil but hardly welcoming to her new daughter-in-law. Marcus's lips twitched. "Neither. She is simply protective. She will warm to you in time." "I fear I'm not what she envisioned for you." "No," he agreed. "You're far more interesting." Before Julia could respond, they were interrupted by the Earl of Westmoreland. "Congratulations again, old friend," the Earl said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "And to you, Lady Valborough." He bowed over Julia's hand. "I must say, Val has been in much better spirits since meeting you. Almost bearable company, in fact." "High praise indeed," Marcus said dryly. "The highest," the Earl confirmed with a grin. "I was beginning to think he'd never find a woman who could penetrate that cynical exterior." Julia looked between the two men, surprised by this characterization of her new husband. "I was under the impression Lord Valborough enjoyed a rather active social life." The Earl laughed. "Oh, he attends the required events and plays the game well enough. But this one," he gestured to Marcus, "has been nursing a rather profound disillusionment with society since his father's death." prefers his books and his estates to most human company. You're making me sound positively misanthropic, West, Marcus said, though there was no heat in his tone. Not misanthropic. Selective. The Earl turned to Julia with a wink. You must have been quite exceptional to catch his attention, my lady. As the Earl moved on to greet other guests, Julia found herself studying her husband with new interest. Was it possible there was more to his pursuit of her than mere physical attraction? More to this marriage than obligation? The remainder of the day passed in a blur of introductions, dancing, and increasingly nerve-wracking anticipation of the evening to come. By the time the last guests departed and Julia was escorted to the Marchioness's chambers to prepare for her wedding night, she was exhausted but wide awake with anxiety. Her new lady's maid, a gift from the Dowager Duchess, helped her change into a nightgown of finest lawn trimmed with delicate lace, then brushed out her long dark hair until it shone. When the maid withdrew, Julia was left alone with her thoughts and fears. Would he be gentle? Would he expect experience she didn't have? Would he compare her to the presumably many women who had come before? A soft knock at the connecting door between their chambers startled her from her ruminations. Julia? Marcus's voice was low. May I enter? She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and moved to the chair near the fire, arranging herself in what she hoped was a dignified pose. Yes, she called, proud that her voice remained steady. The door opened, and Marcus stepped through. He had removed his formal attire and wore only a dressing gown over what appeared to be linen nightclothes. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd run his hands through it, and he looked younger, less formidable. He paused, taking in the sight of her by the fire, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I thought perhaps we might talk, he said, moving to sit in the chair opposite hers. This day has been overwhelming, to say the least. Julia nodded, relief and confusion mingling at this unexpected approach. Yes, it has. I want you to know, he said carefully, that I have no expectations for tonight. Or any night, until you are comfortable. This marriage began under unusual circumstances, and I have no wish to compound any unease you might feel. She stared at him, taken aback by his consideration. Thank you. He smiled slightly. Don't look so surprised. I'm not quite the rake the papers make me out to be. So you've said. She hesitated. Your friend, the Earl, implied something similar earlier. That your reputation is not entirely accurate. West talks too much, Marcus said, though there was affection in his tone. But he's right. I've had my share of liaisons, I won't deny that. But the more scandalous rumors? Greatly exaggerated. Why have you never corrected these impressions? He shrugged. At first, they amused me. Later, I found they served a purpose, keeping fortune hunters and marriage-minded mamas at bay. His gaze met hers directly. Until you, I had no interest in matrimony. What changed? She asked, needing to understand. Marcus was quiet for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. You did not simper or flatter. You challenged me. You saw me, not my title or fortune. The night we met, at the Rutherfords' musical evening, you told me quite bluntly that you found Beethoven's Fifth overwrought and preferred his later quartets. Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks. I recall Lord Rutherford was scandalized by my opinion. He was. I was fascinated. Marcus leaned forward. Every encounter after that only increased my interest. You are different, Julia. Different enough to trap in a conservatory. She couldn't help the edge that crept into her voice. He winced. I deserved that. My methods were impulsive. I wanted to speak with you alone, to determine if my feelings were reciprocated before making a formal approach. And the kiss was presumptuous, as I've acknowledged, he admitted. But not calculated. I simply couldn't help myself. The sincerity in his voice was difficult to dismiss. Julia found herself wanting to believe him, even as caution counseled restraint. So where does that leave us now? She asked. Married, he said with a small smile. But also at the beginning, in many ways. I propose we use this time to truly know one another. To build something real from these unusual foundations. A novel approach to matrimony. I find conventional approaches tedious. His eyes held hers. Will you give us that chance, Julia? To discover if there might be more between us than attraction and circumstance. In that moment, looking at the earnest expression on his handsome face, Julia felt something shift within her. The fear and resentment that had shadowed her since the night of the scandal didn't disappear, but they receded, making room for a cautious hope. Yes, she said softly. I believe I will. The first months of their marriage unfolded in ways Julia could never have predicted. Rather than thrusting her immediately into the whirlwind of society as the new Marchioness, Marcus suggested they retire to his country estate, Valborough Park in Derbyshire, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of London. Society will still be there come autumn, he had said when proposing the plan. And the park is at its most beautiful in summer. Beautiful it certainly was. The sprawling estate nestled among the rolling hills of the Peak District, with formal gardens giving way to wilder parkland and ancient woods. The house itself was a magnificent example of Palladian architecture, imposing yet somehow welcoming, with light-filled rooms and views that took Julia's breath away. But more surprising than the splendor of her new home was the gradual revelation of Marcus himself. Away from London, he seemed to shed layers of reserve, revealing a man of intellect, humor, and unexpected kindness. He showed her his extensive library with boyish enthusiasm, delighting in her appreciation of the rare volumes. He took her riding across the estate, introducing her to tenants and workers with a familiarity that spoke of genuine interest in their lives. In the evenings, they often read aloud to each other, or played chess, or simply talked about everything and nothing. Physical intimacy developed slowly between them. There were kisses, increasingly passionate ones, and tender touches, but Marcus held to his promise not to rush her. Each step forward was by mutual desire, building a trust that Julia had not expected to find in this arranged marriage. You've surprised the staff, Marcus commented one afternoon as they strolled through the rose garden. They expected a pampered London socialite. Instead, they got a woman who visits the tenant farms and discusses crop rotation with the steward. Julia laughed. I grew up in the country, remember? My father may have been a gentleman, but a modest one. I learned about estate management from necessity. Your knowledge is impressive. As is your rapport with the people here. He glanced at her, expression warm. You're a natural lady of the manor. Hardly that, she demurred. I have much to learn still. We all do. He took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar yet still sent a flutter through her. I learn something new about you every day, and each discovery makes me more certain. Certain of what? She asked, though she thought she knew. His grey eyes held hers. That fate may have forced our hands, but it also gave us a gift. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. In the 2 months since their wedding, neither had spoken openly of love, though Julia had felt something growing between them, something deeper than the attraction that had initially drawn them together. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a footman, bearing a silver salver with a letter. From London, my lord, the footman said, offering the tray to Marcus. Marcus took the letter, frowning slightly as he recognized the seal. From West, he murmured, breaking it open. Julia watched as he read, noting how his expression grew grave. Is something wrong? She asked when he had finished. He hesitated, then handed her the letter. It seems our pastoral idyll must come to an end sooner than planned. There is a matter in London requiring my attention. The letter from the Earl was brief but concerning. A former acquaintance of Marcus's, a Mrs. Victoria Sullivan, widow of Colonel Sullivan, had returned to London after several years abroad and was, according to the Earl, making claims of a most disturbing nature regarding Marcus and financial arrangements allegedly made prior to her departure for the continent. Who is this woman? Julia asked, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as signaling discomfort. A brief entanglement from several years ago. Before her marriage. And did you make financial arrangements with her? No, he said firmly. Absolutely not. Whatever she claims, it's false. Julia wanted to believe him without question. The man she had come to know over these past months was honorable, forthright. But she also couldn't forget his reputation, the rumors that had swirled around him in London. Then why would she make such claims now, she asked carefully. Money, I presume. His jaw tightened. The timing is suspect, returning just after my marriage to an heiress. I'm hardly an heiress, Julia pointed out, confusion momentarily overriding her concern. Marcus looked at her strangely. Of course you are. Your father's shipping investments were lost when his partner absconded with the funds, she finished, staring at him in growing bewilderment. That's why I was living with my aunt and uncle. My father left barely enough for me to live modestly as a single woman. I brought nothing to this marriage but myself. It was Marcus's turn to look confused. But your uncle, when I approached him about the marriage, he spoke of your inheritance. Said it was held in trust until your marriage or 25th birthday. A terrible suspicion began to form in Julia's mind. My uncle said that. Marcus nodded slowly. He presented documents. Settlement papers. I didn't question it, I had no reason to. It made no difference to me whether you brought a fortune or not, but he seemed eager to establish that you weren't without means. Julia felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Those documents were false. There is no inheritance, no trust. Her voice hardened. My uncle lied to you. The implications hung heavy between them. If what Marcus said was true, and she had no reason to doubt him, then her uncle had deliberately deceived the Marquess, perhaps hoping to secure the marriage before the truth came to light. Why would he do such a thing? Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Because he knew you might withdraw your offer if you discovered I was truly penniless. Julia turned away, humiliation burning through her. He and my aunt were desperate to see me settled. The scandal provided an opportunity they couldn't resist. She felt Marcus's hands on her shoulders, turning her gently to face him. Julia, look at me. When she reluctantly met his gaze, he continued, if your uncle thought I would withdraw my offer over money, he knows nothing about me. I pursued you, compromised you, and offered marriage because I wanted you or not any fortune you might bring. You say that now, she said softly. But would you have been so eager to marry a penniless orphan without the scandal forcing your hand? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I cannot say with certainty what might have happened in different circumstances. But I know that I have never regretted our marriage, not for a moment. It was an honest answer, if not entirely reassuring. Julia nodded, pulling herself together with effort. We should return to the house. If we are to travel to London, there are preparations to be made. As they walked back in silence, Julia's mind raced. In one conversation, 2 blows had been struck to the fragile foundation of trust she had been building with Marcus. First, the emergence of a woman from his past making claims against him. Then, the revelation that her uncle had lied about her financial circumstances. And beneath it all, the question that had haunted her from the beginning, would Marcus have ever chosen her if not for that scandalous night in the conservatory? London welcomed them back with grey skies and persistent rain, a fitting backdrop to Julia's troubled state of mind. Valborough House, which had seemed intimidating during her brief stay after the wedding, now felt like a fortress against the storm of gossip that had surely been raging in their absence. We shall face this together, Marcus assured her as their carriage pulled up to the imposing townhouse. Whatever Mrs. Sullivan's claims, they can be countered. Julia nodded, though she felt far less confident than she tried to appear. The journey from Derbyshire had given her too much time to think, to worry, to imagine worst-case scenarios. The easy companionship she and Marcus had developed at Valborough Park seemed suddenly fragile in the face of London's harsh realities. The Earl of Westmoreland called on them the very evening of their arrival, his normally cheerful countenance grave. It's worse than I implied in my letter, he told Marcus once they were settled in the library with brandy. Mrs. Sullivan is claiming you promised to marry her, then reneged when a better prospect presented itself. She says you paid her to leave the country and keep silent. Marcus cursed under his breath. That's absurd. I never proposed marriage to Victoria, nor did I pay her to do anything. She has letters, the Earl said quietly. Purportedly from you, suggesting otherwise. Forgeries, then, Marcus snapped. I never wrote such things. Julia, who had insisted on being present for this conversation despite Marcus's initial reluctance, studied her husband's face. He appeared genuinely outraged, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps. As if a piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. You suspect someone else, she said, the realization dawning. Someone who might have reason to forge such letters. Marcus and the Earl exchanged a look. My cousin, Marcus said after a moment. William Vaughan. My father's sister's son. He would inherit the title if I were to die without an heir. You think your cousin is behind this? Julia asked, shocked. It's possible. He and I have never been close, and he's been in financial difficulties for years. My father cut off his allowance after a particularly egregious gambling scandal. But forging letters, conspiring with this Mrs. Sullivan, that's criminal, Julia protested. And difficult to prove, the Earl pointed out. Especially with the lady in question being so convincing in her distress. Have you seen these letters? Julia asked. The Earl nodded. She showed them to me when I confronted her about the rumors she was spreading. They appear authentic, at least to my untrained eye. Your handwriting, your seal. My seal could be copied, Marcus said thoughtfully. And William spent enough time at Valborough as a youth to have had access to my correspondence, to study my hand. What does she want? Julia asked. Money. £20,000, the Earl said grimly. To compensate for her broken heart and damaged prospects. Marcus laughed without humor. A princely sum for a fictional engagement. She threatens to take the letters to the papers if you don't pay, the Earl added. Which would be damaging not only to your reputation but to Lady Valborough's as well. All eyes turned to Julia, and she felt the weight of their concern. Her position as Marchioness was still new, still precarious in the eyes of society. A scandal involving her husband's alleged prior engagement could destroy what little standing she had managed to establish. I won't be blackmailed, Marcus said firmly. And I won't allow Julia's reputation to be damaged by these lies. What do you propose to do? The Earl asked. Marcus was silent for a moment, his expression calculating. I need to speak with Mrs. Sullivan directly. To understand exactly what game she's playing, and who else might be involved. That would be unwise, the Earl cautioned. To be seen meeting privately with the very woman claiming a prior attachment, not privately, Marcus interrupted. At a public event, with witnesses. Somewhere she cannot cause a scene without damaging her own position. Lady Harrington's ball, Julia suggested. It's tomorrow evening, and everyone of consequence will attend. If Mrs. Sullivan is determined to establish herself in society again, she will surely be there. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, that could work. We shall attend together, present a united front. And I shall find an opportunity to speak with Mrs. Sullivan in full view of the ton, but privately enough to get answers. The plan settled, the Earl soon took his leave, promising to continue gathering information about Mrs. Sullivan's movements and association since her return to London. When they were alone, Julia turned to Marcus. You didn't tell me everything just now. What else do you suspect? He looked at her with surprise that quickly turned to appreciation. You're becoming quite adept at reading me. Answer the question, she said, not to be deterred. Marcus sighed, moving to pour himself another measure of brandy. Victoria Sullivan was involved with William before she and I had our brief liaison. I didn't know it at the time, discovered it only afterward. There was bad blood between them when she left for the continent. You think they're working together now? despite this past animosity. "I think money can heal many wounds," Marcus said dryly. "And William has always been creative when it comes to schemes that might profit him." Julia considered this. "If your cousin is behind this, his goal can't simply be money. £20,000 is a considerable sum, but not life-changing for a man of your wealth." "No," Marcus agreed. "But public humiliation? Damage to my standing? That would give him great satisfaction." He hesitated. "And if the scandal were severe enough to cause problems between us?" "He thinks I might leave you," Julia realized, "creating the possibility that you would never have an heir." Marcus nodded grimly. "William has always played the long game, for all his impulsive vices." Julia moved to stand before her husband, taking his hands in hers. "Then he has gravely miscalculated. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Mrs. Sullivan claims, I am your wife, Marcus. I stand with you." The gratitude in his eyes was tempered with something else, a vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed. "Even though our marriage began with deception? My impulsive actions, your uncle's lies. Perhaps especially because of those things," she said softly. "We have built something real despite those inauspicious beginnings. I won't allow anyone to destroy it with more lies." He drew her into his arms then, holding her as if she were something precious he feared losing. And Julia, returning his embrace, realized with sudden clarity that somewhere along the way, between scandal and discovery, between Derbyshire peace and London intrigue, she had fallen in love with her husband. Lady Harrington's ballroom blazed with hundreds of candles, the light reflecting off jewels and gilt decoration until the entire room seemed to shimmer. Julia felt every eye upon them as she and Marcus made their entrance, the whispers starting immediately. "The Valboroughs? Married so suddenly after that scandal. Heard a widow has returned from the continent making claims." Julia held her head high, her hand resting on Marcus's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that made her eyes appear almost violet, her dark hair arranged in an elegant coiffure adorned with sapphires, a wedding gift from Marcus. "You look magnificent," he murmured as they made their way through the crowd. "Every man here envies me. And every woman watches for signs of discord between us," she replied quietly. "Have you seen her yet?" Marcus's gaze swept the room. "No. But she'll be here." They had barely completed their obligatory greeting of their hostess when the Earl appeared at their side. "She's by the south windows," he said without preamble. "In burgundy silk, speaking with Lady Caldwell." Julia followed his discreet gesture and saw a striking woman of perhaps 30, with auburn hair and a figure that even the modest cut of her widow's gown couldn't disguise. Mrs. Sullivan laughed at something her companion said, the sound carrying across the room, calculated, Julia thought, to draw attention. "She's watching us while pretending not to," Julia observed. "Of course she is," Marcus said. "She's waiting for me to approach her, to appear anxious or concerned." "Then we mustn't give her that satisfaction," Julia decided. "We shall dance, converse with our friends, appear perfectly at ease. Let her wonder what we know or don't know." The strategy proved effective. As the evening progressed, Julia noticed Mrs. Sullivan casting increasingly frequent glances in their direction, her expression growing less confident. The widow moved from group to group, clearly trying to position herself where Marcus might naturally approach her, but he studiously avoided doing so. It was Julia who finally suggested a different approach. "I should speak with her first," she said as they paused between dances. Marcus looked at her in surprise. "You?" "No, Julia. This is my battle. It involves me too," she pointed out. "And she won't expect it. It might throw her off balance enough to reveal something useful." He hesitated, concern evident in his expression. "She's dangerous, Julia. Calculating. So am I, when necessary." Julia smiled slightly. "Trust me." After a moment, Marcus nodded. "Very well. But I'll be watching. At the first sign of distress, you'll remain exactly where you are," she finished firmly. "I need to do this myself." She made her approach during a lull in the dancing, when Mrs. Sullivan stood momentarily alone near one of the tall windows. The widow's eyes widened slightly as Julia neared, though she quickly composed her features into a polite mask. "Mrs. Sullivan, I believe," Julia said, her voice pleasant but cool. "I am Lady Valborough." "My lady." Mrs. Sullivan curtsied, a perfect blend of respect and subtle challenge. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Is it?" Julia raised an eyebrow. "I would have thought you'd be avoiding me, given the nature of your claims regarding my husband." The direct approach visibly startled the widow. I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Julia moved closer, lowering her voice. "The forged letters, the fabricated engagement, the demand for money. A clever scheme, though not as clever as you and your co-conspirator believe." Mrs. Sullivan's complexion paled beneath her rouge. "How dare you?" "I dare because I am the Marchioness of Valborough," Julia interrupted smoothly. "And because my husband and I know exactly what game you're playing, and who put you up to it." She watched the widow's expression closely, saw the flicker of alarm in her eyes. Not guilt or fear of exposure, Julia realized, but surprise. As if Julia had said something unexpected. "You don't know anything," Mrs. Sullivan said, recovering her composure. "Your husband made promises to me long before he ever met you. Promises he failed to keep. Curious that you never mentioned these promises until after our marriage," Julia noted. "One might almost think the timing was calculated." "Think what you like," the widow said, a new confidence entering her tone. "But I have proof of Marcus's affections, and his intentions." "Forged proof," Julia countered. Mrs. Sullivan smiled thinly. "Are you so certain? Has Marcus told you everything about our past? About the real reason I left England?" She leaned closer. "Ask him about the ring, Lady Valborough. The one with the emerald and pearls. Ask him who it belonged to before he gave it to me." Before Julia could respond, another voice joined their conversation. "I believe I can answer that question." Both women turned to find the Dowager Duchess of Valborough standing beside them, regal in silver silk and diamonds. Marcus's mother fixed Mrs. Sullivan with an icy stare. "That ring, madam, has never left my jewel box," the Duchess said coldly. "It was my mother's betrothal ring, and before that, it belonged to my grandmother. No son of mine would have given such a family heirloom to a woman of your reputation." Mrs. Sullivan seemed to shrink under the Duchess's withering gaze. "Your Grace, you will leave this ball immediately," the Duchess continued, her voice low but carrying. "You will retract whatever slanderous claims you have made about my son. And you will return to whatever corner of the continent you crawled from, or I shall personally ensure that not a single door in London, or indeed, in England, opens to you again." The threat, delivered with aristocratic certainty, hung in the air between them. For a moment, Julia thought Mrs. Sullivan might defy the Duchess, but then the widow's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. "This isn't over," she said, though the conviction had drained from her voice. "Oh, I rather think it is," the Duchess replied. "Unless you wish the authorities to examine those letters you claim to possess. Forgery is a serious crime, after all." Without another word, Mrs. Sullivan turned and made her way toward the exit, her proud bearing the only dignity remaining to her. "Well handled, my dear," the Duchess said to Julia when they were alone. "Though perhaps a bit reckless." Julia looked at her mother-in-law in surprise. "You were listening." "I've been watching that woman all evening," the Duchess said. "When I saw you approach her, I moved closer. Marcus isn't the only one who can be protective." The simple statement, delivered with characteristic restraint, nonetheless warmed Julia unexpectedly. The Dowager Duchess had maintained a polite distance since the wedding, correct but not particularly warm. This intervention, this implied acceptance, felt like a significant shift. "Thank you," Julia said sincerely, "for your help and your trust. You've proven worthy of both." The Duchess glanced across the room to where Marcus was making his way toward them, concern evident in his stride. "My son has chosen better than I initially gave him credit for." Before Julia could respond, Marcus reached them. "What happened?" he demanded. "I saw Victoria leave in a hurry." "Your mother happened," Julia said with a small smile, and reminded Mrs. Sullivan of the consequences of lying about the Valborough family. Marcus looked between the two women, surprise giving way to relief. "Mother, I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "Clearly," the Duchess said dryly. "Or you might have included me in whatever strategy you and Julia devised." She patted her son's arm. "No matter. The immediate threat appears neutralized, though I suspect we haven't heard the last of this affair." "What did she say to you?" Marcus asked Julia. "She mentioned a ring," Julia replied, watching his reaction carefully. "An emerald and pearl ring she claimed you gave her." Marcus frowned. "I never gave Victoria any jewelry, let alone a family heirloom." "I know," Julia assured him. "Your mother made that quite clear. But it was the specificity of the claim that struck me. She described the ring in detail, as if she had seen it, even if she never possessed it." The Duchess's expression sharpened. "That ring is kept in my personal safe at Valborough House. Few people even know of its existence outside the family." "William knows," Marcus said, the pieces falling into place. "He was present when Father showed it to me before he died, explaining its significance for when I would one day become engaged." "Then we have our answer," Julia said quietly. "Mrs. Sullivan could only have known about that ring through your cousin." The three Valboroughs exchanged grave looks, the implications clear. William Vaughan's involvement in the scheme was now all but confirmed, though proving it would be another matter entirely. "We shall discuss our next steps tomorrow," the Duchess decided. "For now, you should both continue to circulate, appear completely untroubled. The Tun is watching, and appearance matters almost as much as truth." As the Duchess moved away to speak with an old friend, Marcus took Julia's hand, his expression serious. "You took a risk confronting her." "A calculated one," Julia replied. "And it paid off." "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "Your courage, your cleverness." He stopped, seeming to search for words. "Yes," she prompted when he didn't continue. Instead of answering, he raised her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dance with me," he said finally. "Let all of London see that whatever storms may come, the Marquess and Marchioness of Valborough stand together." As he led her onto the dance floor, Julia felt a curious mixture of triumph and uncertainty. They had weathered this first challenge together, had presented the united front Marcus had spoken of. But Mrs. Sullivan's insinuations, the involvement of Marcus's cousin, the underlying question of trust between them, all remained unresolved. And beneath it all, the words Julia had not yet spoken aloud, "I love you." Did Marcus feel the same? Or was their partnership, for all its growing warmth and respect, still fundamentally one of convenience and circumstance? The music swelled around them, and Julia pushed these thoughts aside. For now, it was enough to be in his arms, moving in perfect harmony across the ballroom floor, the scandals and schemes momentarily held at bay by the simple joy of the dance. The carriage ride home from Lady Harrington's ball was quiet, both Julia and Marcus lost in their own thoughts. The night had been a victory of sorts. Mrs. Sullivan's hasty departure and the Duchess's unexpected support had turned potential disaster into a manageable situation. Yet Julia sensed that Marcus was troubled, his gaze fixed on the passing streetlights, his hand occasionally tightening around hers. When they arrived at Valborough House, he surprised her by asking if she would join him in his study rather than retiring immediately. "There are things we should discuss," he said, his expression grave. "Things I should have told you before now." The study was one of Julia's favorite rooms in the London house, warm with mahogany paneling and lined with books, a space that reflected Marcus's character more than the grander public rooms. A fire had been lit against the evening chill, and Marcus poured them each a small glass of sherry before joining her on the leather sofa. "What Victoria said to you tonight, about our past, wasn't entirely false," he began, his voice carefully measured. "We did have an association, several years ago. Brief, but more significant than I implied earlier." Julia nodded, unsurprised by this admission. I assumed as much. Few women would attempt such a scheme without some genuine connection to build upon. She was William's mistress first, Marcus continued. Though I didn't know that at the time. I met her at a house party in Sussex. She was there as a companion to the elderly hostess, Lady Darlington. She was beautiful, charming, apparently respectable despite her somewhat ambiguous social position. And you were attracted to her, Julia said, keeping her voice neutral. Yes. He didn't try to deny it. We spent time together over those 2 weeks. Nothing improper occurred at the house party itself, but afterward, when we had both returned to London. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. You became lovers, Julia finished for him. Marcus nodded. For about 3 months. Then I discovered she had been involved with William, and that she had concealed other aspects of her past as well. There was an estranged husband, not dead as she had claimed. Financial improprieties. I ended the relationship immediately. And the alleged promise of marriage? The payment to leave England. Complete fabrications, Marcus said firmly. I never proposed, never gave her money. She left England shortly after our relationship ended, and I assumed it was to escape the gossip that had begun to circulate about her true circumstances. Julia was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. Why didn't you tell me all this when the Earl first brought news of her return? Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as signaling discomfort or stress. I was ashamed, I suppose. Not of the liaison itself, I was unattached, as was she, as far as I knew at the time. But of my poor judgment. I should have seen through her deception sooner. And you feared I might doubt you if I knew the full extent of your history with her, Julia added perceptively. Yes. He met her gaze directly. Our marriage was still so new, still finding its footing. And then to have this spectre from my past emerge, making false claims. You wanted to protect what we've been building. Exactly. Relief crossed his features at her understanding. But I realize now that withholding the truth, however uncomfortable, was a mistake. Trust must go both ways. Julia reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. Thank you for telling me now. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Then Julia asked the question that had been lingering in her mind since the ball. What will we do about your cousin? If he is indeed behind Mrs. Sullivan's claims, he's unlikely to stop with this failed attempt. Marcus's expression hardened. No, he won't stop easily. William has always been envious of my position, resentful of what he sees as the injustice of birth order and inheritance. But to take such direct action against me, and by extension, against you, he crosses a line I cannot ignore. Do you have proof of his involvement? Not yet. But I will. His tone left no doubt of his determination. In the meantime, we should return to Derbyshire as soon as possible. Valborough Park is safer, more easily secured. And William has never been welcome there. My father saw to that after the last scandal. Julia nodded, though the thought of retreating to the country felt somehow like defeat. And Mrs. Sullivan? My mother will ensure she leaves London, if not England entirely, Marcus said with confidence. The Dowager Duchess's social influence is not to be underestimated. I witnessed that firsthand tonight, Julia said with a small smile. She was formidable. She was protecting her family, Marcus replied. Which now includes you. The simple statement warmed Julia unexpectedly. I'm glad she was there tonight. Not just for her intervention with Mrs. Sullivan, but it felt like acceptance, in a way I hadn't experienced from her before. My mother is slow to warm to people, Marcus acknowledged. But once she does, her loyalty is absolute. What you did tonight, confronting Victoria directly, standing your ground, impressed her. She values courage above most other qualities. Julia hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. And you? What do you value, Marcus? He looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes intent on her face. Honesty, he said finally. Loyalty. intelligence, compassion. He reached up to touch her cheek gently. All qualities you possess in abundance. Yet our marriage began with neither of us being entirely honest, she pointed out softly. You pursuing me with intentions you didn't fully disclose. My uncle lying about my financial circumstances. True, Marcus acknowledged. But what matters more is what we've built since then. What we continue to build each day. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Julia, there's something I need to ask you. Something I've wondered since we left Derbyshire. Yes? Are you happy? The question was simple but loaded with meaning. As my wife, as Marchioness. Is this life, am I, or what you would have chosen if circumstances had been different? The vulnerability in his voice caught at Julia's heart. She thought of their months at Valborough Park, of the genuine partnership that had developed between them, of the passion that had grown from initial attraction into something deeper and more meaningful. I'm happier than I ever expected to be, she said truthfully. When we married, I feared I was simply a solution to a problem, the scandal that needed to be contained. I didn't anticipate finding a true companion, someone who values my mind as well as. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. As well as your beauty. Marcus supplied, a hint of his usual confidence returning. Your charm? Your remarkably expressive eyes? Stop, she laughed, though pleasure at the compliments warmed her. His expression grew serious again. I need you to know something, Julia. That night in the conservatory, I didn't plan for us to be discovered. But I had already decided to court you properly, to seek your hand in marriage. The scandal merely accelerated my timeline. She stared at him, startled by this revelation. Truly? Truly? He took both her hands in his. I pursued you initially because you intrigued me. I married you because circumstance demanded it. But I've grown to, he stopped, seeming to struggle for words. Julia, what I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I love you. Not out of obligation or convenience, but truly, deeply love you. And I hope, with time, you might come to feel the same. The words hung between them, a confession Julia had longed for but hadn't dared to expect. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the emotion in his voice, in his eyes. Marcus, she said finally, her own voice scarcely above a whisper, I already do. The kiss that followed was different from any they had shared before, not the cautious exploration of their early days, nor the growing passion of recent weeks, but something deeper, more profound. A promise, a commitment, a declaration without words. When they finally drew apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. One scandalous night changed both our fates, he murmured. For the better, I think. For the better, Julia agreed, thinking of all that had transpired since that moment in Lady Hempstead's conservatory. The hasty marriage, the gradual discovery of each other, the challenges overcome and those still to face. Their path had been unconventional, marked by scandal and deception. But in those obstacles, they had found truth. In that scandalous beginning, they had found love. And whatever storms lay ahead, William's schemes, society's judgment, the responsibilities of their position, Julia knew they would weather them together. Not as the reluctant participants in a marriage of necessity, but as partners who had chosen each other, scandal and all.